Hey everyone, I want to go through the introduction for our cell respiration chapter. This again is going to make a lot of connections to what we had already learned about in photosynthesis. So we'll see some repeat information, which is good that we already have kind of like a baseline understanding. Um, Cell respiration, like I said, is going to have some connections, kind of reverse connections to photosynthesis. But we're going to focus on um, basically the electrons and the energy coupling that occurs there and how we end up with a whole load of ATP. When you see the words cell respiration, oftentimes in the book, they're going to be talking about the combination of a process known as aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Um, and there's another process of respiration called fermentation, which we'll get into as well. Um, so here are learning targets for this chapter. Basically, you should be able to summarize the chemical equation for cell respiration, identify the reactants and the products, be able to say, here is the original source of those reactants, and here is where they end up in the products and where their fate is. Like I said, we want to know the difference between fermentation or anaerobic respiration versus cellular respiration, aka aerobic respiration. There's going to be three main steps that go with cell respiration. So one of the steps is called glycolysis and how that plays a role in oxidizing glucose into a molecule known as pyruvate. The next step is called the citric acid cycle. So we'll focus on how that pyruvate moves through the citric acid cycle and kind of couples with these electron carriers, NADH and FADH. Then they'll go through a final step, which is called oxidative phosphorylation, which combines two things we've already learned about, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis as well. And so how we end up with ATP produced from that step and ATP synthase, generating a large amount of ATP that will drive our cellular processes. So the first step that I want to go through with you includes this connection between photosynthesis and cell respiration. So basically, in our open systems, cells require energy to perform work, and that can be performed through a variety of processes, whether it's chemical, transport, or mechanical. But basically, as we're looking at this, we kind of have a linear process of energy, sunlight entering in, and then heat energy leaving, and then we can see the recycling of certain molecules here. So the first step talks about how energy flows into an ecosystem as sunlight. That energy is stored in, will ultimately, be stored in molecules of food, and that came from the sun. That energy is going to flow into the ecosystem as sunlight, and it'll leave as heat. In contrast with our cycling molecules here, the chemical elements essential to life will be recycled. We've got photosynthesis that's going to generate our organic molecules. And oxygen, I almost left that one out. And then those organic molecules are going to be used by the mitochondria over here, which includes like our plants and our algae. For our eukaryotic cells, that is included in that, besides our heterotrophic organisms. And that's going to be fuel for cell respiration. And cell respiration is going to break down that fuel and generate some ATP. The waste products of that respiration are carbon dioxide and water. And then those will serve as raw materials for photosynthesis over here. So we're going to consider how cells harvest the chemical energy that gets stored in these organic molecules and then use it to generate ATP. So there's going to be kind of those three steps that I talked about before. All right. So the first thing that I want to get into is kind of a recap of our metabolism, um, enzyme energy chapter that we covered before. So this first diagram here I have as a recap for our catabolic reactions. Sorry. Um, I had a tickle in my throat. All right. So we have at the beginning here organic compounds. Those are going to possess potential energy, which are, stored in the bonds based off of the arrangement of their atoms, right? So these can go through some exergonic reactions and can act as fuels, but they need some help from some enzymes. So some of the energy that's taken out of the chemical storage can be used to do work, and then the rest of that is going to be released or dissipated as heat over here. Um, so we'll talk about how fermentation and aerobic respiration both play a role in these catabolic processes. Um, and then leave us with some cellular energy known as ATP. All right, so again, we want to be able to identify our chemical equations for both cell respiration and photosynthesis. So again, cell respiration, the reactants are going to be glucose and oxygen, and the products are going to be water, carbon dioxide, and ATP, and a little bit of heat as well. That generation of a large amount of ATP um, is going to be representative of the energy that's leaving. So that's an exergonic reaction for cell respiration. Then recapping photosynthesis, we know that's going to utilize water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. That sunlight is required for the reaction to occur. So we know that's going to be an endergonic reaction. And then that's going to release our organic molecule of glucose and oxygen, which then can go back and play the initial role as reactants for cell respiration. So these two processes are best buds. We do want to be aware of how catabolic pathways decompose glucose and then yield some energy. So through this process, this is called redox reactions, and it focuses on the transfer of electrons during chemical reactions. If you're in CIS chemistry, and I know you talk about it in general chemistry as well, you have already been exposed to the understanding of redox reactions, but they're also known as oxidation or reduction reactions. So in a redox reaction, there will be a loss of electrons from one substance, which is called oxidation. And then there will be an addition of electrons to another substance, which is called reduction. And I remember this with the mnemonic device oil rig. So oxidation is loss of electrons for oil, and rig is reduction is gain of electrons. So oil rig. And so just take note, when you add electrons, that's called reduction because the negatively charged electrons that you added to the atom are going to reduce the amount of, positive space that's, or the positive charges that are in the atom. So I just want to make sure that's clear. When you add electrons, it's actually reduction. So if we look at the general redox reaction in this top equation over here, we can see this starting reactant Xe with its negative charge or its ion over here. This is the electron donor. It's called the reducing agent. It reduces Y over here, and Y is going to accept that donated electron. Substance Y is the electron acceptor, and so that is known as the oxidizing agent, and it's going to oxidize the molecule or this substance Xe, and it's going to remove its electron. Because an electron transfer requires both the donor and the acceptor, So we see oxidation and reduction happening. So they always go together. If we look at the bottom down here, this is our cell respiration equation, but it is missing one piece, right? So we have our organic molecule of glucose, we have our oxygen, it's producing water, carbon dioxide, and our ever coveted ATP molecule, right? So glucose over here is going to be our reducing agent or the electron donor. Over here, oxygen is going to be the electron acceptor or the oxidizing agent. And so it's going to oxidize glucose, therefore removing its electron. And so we're going to see the combination of oxidation and reduction together in cell respiration. At the end of our reaction, I had ATP, and there's going to be a lot of ATP molecules that are generated in cell respiration. And I wanted to make sure that I covered what ATP is with you. I usually spend a couple days on this, but I realized back in our metabolism chapter, we just didn't have enough time. So I skipped it and saved it for here. So if we take its name, its official name, adenosine triphosphate, we can see that is down here. Sorry, that popped up, but we can see it in its general structure down here. ATP is a nucleic acid. So a reminder of nucleic acids. They are going to have a sugar. So we got our carbon ring over here. They're going to have their phosphate groups, so we can see that in the PO4s on the left. And then it's going to have a nitrogenous base. So we see the nitrogen rings up here. So that makes it a nucleic acid. It's going to have a role in energy coupling, and it's also used to make RNA, which is important. So we'll be using this again. But basically, these bonds over here in its triphosphate location over here on the left, those bonds can be broken by hydrolysis. So we see the addition of water down here. That water will go through and break off the terminal phosphate group over here at the end. And then it'll release that little phosphate group, which will now be an inorganic phosphate. And we abbreviate it, calling it PI or pi, however you want to say, but I'll always say PI. So that's the terminal phosphate that was broken from hydrolysis of ATP. Okay. And then what's left over is adenosine diphosphate. So we only have two phosphates left over, which is an energy poor version of it because of that broken bond that occurred. So I just wanted to make sure we're on that same page. So we can see that there is, again, this combination of anabolic and catabolic reactions happening between our ATP and ADP molecules. I know in photosynthesis we talked about these already, but I wanted to make sure you had the chemical understanding of it. Okay, so what happens next for cell respiration? The process is really going to focus on that energy harvest and how electrons move and fall from the breakdown of organic molecules to oxygen. So there's kind of a stepwise process that's going to occur here for the energy harvesting in cell respiration. If energy is released all at once, it can't really be harnessed efficiently for constructive work. So we kind of need a stepwise process for it to occur. So basically, as we look at this, cell respiration doesn't oxidize glucose in one explosive step. It's going to go through and break it down in a series of steps. So it's going to start off as organic molecules. It'll move into an NADH molecule, which will then travel down the electron transport chain, and that will lead us to our oxygen. So at some key steps, we've got electrons that will be stripped off of our glucose molecule. And so as we talk about our oxidation reactions, those electrons will travel and pick up some protons along the way. So that's where these hydrogen ions are coming into play. They'll be passed first to electron carrier or a coenzyme, which is known as NADA plus, which is, or NAD plus, sorry, I think I said NADA. NAD plus is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, a crazy name, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, that's going to function as an oxidizing agent during cell respiration. Okay. So that NAD plus coenzyme is going to pick up and deliver those electrons and hydrogen ions from our glucose, and it's going to oxidize it and then store it as in those bonds, and it'll be a molecule now known as NADH. So first step is stripping the glucose of electrons. They are accepted by the NAD plus molecule coenzyme. It's going to pick up those electrons and the hydrogen ions and form NADH. That NADH is then going to travel down the electron transport chain, or the ETC, and then that electron transport chain will deliver those electrons to oxygen, which will then produce water, H2O, and release that energy. So here's our NAD plus molecule. So you can see that again. NAD plus is going to be an electron shuttle. Basically, its name is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And here's our dinucleotide. Okay. Again, we can see that in its structure. Let's see, here's our phosphate groups that hold that dinucleotide piece together over here in yellow. And then the nicotinamide up here is the nitrogenous base, even though it's not one that we see in like DNA and RNA, it is a nitrogenous base. So it's going to be this enzymatic transfer of 2 electrons stripped from that glucose molecule. We'll have one hydrogen ion that will flow with it also from our organic molecule, and then a second hydrogen ion that's going to be released. And then those will be transferred along with NAD plus to form NADH over here. All right, so on to the electron transport chain, which we've talked about and said it plays a role in photosynthesis, but I didn't go into the details of that. So we're going to just generally talk about uncontrolled reactions over here, and then I'll talk about specifically how the electron transport chain assists during the harvesting of energy. So if you just generally are mixing hydrogen gas and oxygen gas and have a little spark for activation energy, those gases are going to combine explosively, right? They'll release a ton of energy, and that's a combustion reaction, which powers the main engines of our space shuttles when they're launched, right? So this explosion is representing how energy is released. And those electrons can kind of fall, those electrons from hydrogen will fall closer to the electronegative oxygen atoms. So cell respiration also does this process of taking hydrogen and oxygen and putting them together to form water. But there are some main differences between cell respiration and then this uncontrolled explosive reaction over here. The first one is that, cell respiration, the hydrogen is going to react with oxygen. That's going to be derived from our organic molecules rather than it being made from hydrogen gas, right? So that hydrogen comes from our glucose molecules, that sort of thing. And then the second difference is that instead of using one explosive reaction, right, this cell respiration process is going to use this stepwise electron transport chain over here to break the fall of those electrons, so that it's into this like stepwise process of releasing energy versus one big explosive one. So again, if we're looking at this image over here, electrons are going to be removed from glucose. They're going to be shuttled by the NADH molecule. Like I said before, in our stepwise process, they will be shuttled to the top of this higher energy end of the chain, and then down over here at the bottom of the chain where we have our lower energy end, that oxygen is going to capture those electrons along with the hydrogen ions, and they're going to form water down here. So electron transfer from that NADH molecule to oxygen is going to be exergonic. And then instead of wasting a lot of energy in one single explosive step, those electrons are going to go through kind of like this cascade down the chain, which is really important. So each downhill carrier is going to be more electronegative, and then capable of oxidizing its uphill neighbor. So it's kind of this stepwise process. Again, the route is glucose to NADH to the electron transport chain to oxygen. Okay, so cell respiration is going to be broken down into three main steps, and we'll see how those previous pieces fall into play here. But the three steps are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. I'm just going to briefly outline these steps, and then the next few days I'll go into detail on each of them. But our first step is glycolysis. And if you take that word and break it down, we see glyco, that's kind of related to glycogen or glucose. And lysis has to deal with splitting. So we're going to split or break down glucose into two molecules in glycolysis. This glycolysis process is going to take place in the cytosol or the cytoplasm of the cell. So when glucose is split, it's going to turn into a compound called pyruvate. And so in the second step, we can see that pyruvate is going to be oxidized over here and used in the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. Annoying, it has two names, but we know that happens all the time. The citric acid cycle is going to happen in the mitochondrial matrix, so inside the mitochondria, and it's going to complete the breakdown of glucose by oxidizing those pyruvate molecules into carbon dioxide. So one of our products, carbon dioxide, is going to be released during the citric acid cycle. And then, let's see. Yeah, sorry, carbon dioxide is released. I said that, right, as being a product. So some of these steps of glycolysis and citric acid cycle up here are going to be redox reactions, which are going to transfer their electrons to form NADH. So they'll transfer their electrons to that NAD plus molecule we were referring to earlier to make NADH. And then in our third step here, oxidative phosphorylation, that's going to have the combination of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So during the electron transport chain, that'll accept those electrons that were broken down in the first two steps over here, and then pass those electrons from one molecule to another. So we have that whole chain happening that we saw on the previous slide. And then that energy released at each step of the chain will be stored in the mitochondria and then can be used later to make ATP. And then that mode of ATP synthesis is going to happen in that oxidative phosphorylation process. Let's see. So at the end of it, we'll have that chemiosmosis process with the ATP synthase happening. And this is where 90% of the ATP is going to be generated in the oxidative phosphorylation step of cell respiration. So we'll see lots of similarities to what we saw with chemiosmosis, ATP synthase, electron transport chain, that sort of thing, in the next coming videos.